So, despite the years since since his death nearly 15 years ago, Egyptian amateur music collector Ragh Muftah is still very much with us. In the Egyptian Coptic Christian community, his memory is frequently evoked among hymn enthusiasts, bishops, and clergy as, quote, the father of Coptic music, esteemed for what many regard as saving a Coptic music heritage. Over a year that spanned 75 years, he tirelessly worked to notate and record the Orthodox liturgical genre into Western music notation, a notation that he himself and the cantors that he worked with actually couldn't read. Nonetheless, between 1927 to the end of his life in 2001, Muftah commissioned Western composers, musicologists, and Coptic cantors to produce 16 folios of music transcriptions, a plethora of accompanying reel-to-reel recordings, and finally a major publication transcribing one complete Orthodox liturgical genre in 1998. These folios, along with the recordings, are almost all housed at the U.S. Library of Congress and at the Institute of Coptic Studies in Cairo, Egypt, where Muftah founded the Coptic Music Department in 1954. Between 2008 and 2009, I first joined the Library of Congress to curate what had come to be known as the Ragh Muftah collection: music transcriptions, recordings, letters, photographs, videos, even historical maps outlining where Muftah lived, worked, and collected Coptic hymns. My job was to fulfill a part of Muftah's dying wish, to make Coptic liturgical hymns accessible to the entire world. This feat was made possible through an online exhibit called The Coptic Orthodox Liturgical Chant and Hymnody, featured on the library's Performing Arts Encyclopedia. Specifically, Muftah hoped to make his recordings accessible to all Coptic cantors, with the urgent reminder that Alhan, or as they're called in Arabic, were the last connection to a pharaonic and pre-Islamic Egypt. Together with English composer and transcriber Ernest Newland Smith, Muftah worked to uncover what they both believed were unchanged melodies from a past buried under what Newland Smith called, quote, an appalling debris of Arabic and other ornamentation. In this paper, I investigate Coptic music debates of authenticity on modernity through early music transcriptions, and how, despite not being able to read them, the Ragh Muftah collection has come to represent and even construct an Orthodox music canon, both to the Coptic community in Egypt and increasingly abroad. Drawing on Michel Foucault's pivotal Archaeologies of Knowledge and Edward Said's critical notion of Orientalism, I explored the contemporary discursive politics of sound archives in Coptic articulations of community, legitimacy, indigeneity, and agency as a religious and political minority in a Muslim-majority nation. And to give you some numbers here, Copts make approximately 12 to 15% of Egypt's 90 million people. While Edward Said famously identified Orientalism as Europe's way of coming to terms with itself by framing, inventing, and shaping the Orient as its most occurring image of the other, I ask, how have today's Coptic Orthodox cantors and activists strategically rendered Western music transcriptions as sound objects with which to negotiate community authenticity and difference as Egypt's last remaining modern sons of the pharaohs? And here I'm quoting the title of one of the earliest British anthropologists to work with the community. As the principal curator of the site, I explore how Western scholarly encounters, including my own, have not only entangled Coptic music discourses in a Western-centered teleology of modernity and progress, but rather in emulating the West, Coptic music discourses are also infused with Orientalist critiques that equate heterophony and embellishments of Arab debris as marked signs of backwardness. Through ethnographic research, first in Egypt and then preliminarily among Canada's largest diaspora choir in Mississauga, I illustrate how these music conversations strategically co-opt Orientalist discourses to articulate larger relational critiques of Egyptian Muslims, negotiate Coptic identity politics, and finally navigate at times exclusionary narratives of Egyptian belonging following the 2011 Egyptian uprising. So Ragh Muftah comes from a prominent and educated family that as early as the 19th century already worked to reformulate and modernize Coptic religious education. His paternal uncle and a Coptic language teacher, Ariane Girgis Muftah, had worked with one of the community's earliest officiated cantors to produce the first liturgical hymn book, The Service of the Deacons, in 1859. This book, listing only the hymn texts, coincided with the arrival of the second printing press to arrive to Egypt, just a few years following the first press imported by the Khedive Ottoman Empire. As a hallmark of modernity's technological advancement, an illustration of the wedded relationship between textuality, sound, and notions of modernity, historian Paul Sedra writes that Coptic cantors not only sung a procession of liturgical hymns at the arrival of the printing press to the Coptic Patriarchy, but the very first book that this press printed was to accompany the Coptic thoroughly sung liturgical service. And if anyone's interested, it's about 3 hours long every Sunday. So it's quite long. It's no surprise then that Ariane Girgis Muftah's nephew, Raghib, would dedicate 80 of his 102 years to the textualization of Coptic melodies through transcription into Western music notation. The Coptic liturgical hymnody, known in Alhan in Arabic, was and continues to be a largely monophonic oral tradition. It's almost entirely unaccompanied, with the exception of a small pair of cymbals and a metal triangle to keep rhythm, and it's largely disseminated from male cantor to cantor without any notation. As early as the 3rd and 4th century, unearthed Greek manuscripts testified the transmission of an oral liturgical genre with an indigenous notation system that acted as mnemonic aids to the cantors. Largely comprised of dots and dashes over the texts, this music notation didn't connote pitches or intervals, rhythm, or duration, but instead reminded singers of the simple direction of the melody and its melismas. Today, a similar system exists. Known as hazet, literally movement or motion in Arabic, this local shorthand reminds Coptic cantors of the length of melismas, placement of the vowels in words, as well as the upward and downward motion of extended melodies. In other words, hazet are like maps, so that's the other word for them in Arabic, and they help maintain the terrain they help singers to maintain the terrain of hymns that are at first performed in an antiquated language that no one largely speaks today, and secondly, more singers during hymns that can go on for upwards of 15 minutes on a single vowel. So primarily used as an education tool of hymn transmission, teretil notations are rarely seen in performance, and the shorthand can actually change from person to person. So what I'm showing you is one that's been sort of typed on computer, but there are many that are just shorthand over the texts. So here's just another one where people get really creative and are using fonts like candles and little crosses, and so it's really neat. But singers who work with one particular singer or one particular teacher are aware of their system and know it. So to give you an idea of what the genre sounds like, we'll first listen to a very contemporary singer today. He's the cantor of the Coptic Patriarchy, just to give you an idea of what it sounds like. And I actually also just want to show you this hazet system in motion, but this is the Heritage Choir in Mississauga. And we'll listen to that very, very briefly. I'm going to be repeating for a while, so I'll spare you that. In one of his last interviews in 1999, Raghib Muftah cited a Christian reformist movement that inspired the beginning of his project to capture Coptic music in Western music notation. This Coptic communal reform, initiated by landed and wealthy elite, emerged as a response to a growing Egyptian agitation for independence from British occupation and to resist the influence of American Presbyterian missionaries in the early 19th century. This reform aimed to, quote, enlighten and modernize the Orthodox clerical class, who at this point in history largely came from a non-literate and hereditary peasant class. To achieve their goal, Paul Sederer writes that intellectuals initiated textualizing and moralizing processes that later significantly altered Coptic subjectivities and religious identities. Borrowing Orientalist archaeological interests in Copts and the belief that they were the direct and unadulterated descendants of the pharaohs, and missionary beliefs that they were the descendants of Christian ancients, Coptic reformers ushered in strategic narratives of exceptionalism to lay claim both to their land and social status. So such discourses of belonging, exceptionalism, and modernity especially distilled themselves in early Coptic music reforms. And in the following century, they had great implications for Christian and Muslim interrelations. Rather, in an Aristotelian sense, early reformists borrowed missionary convictions that a modern and specifically Christian nation could only be attained if its citizens pursued a pious self through devotional and liturgical music. Additionally, early Coptic educators also inherently picked up missionary bias towards Arab culture and Muslim Egyptians who overtly resisted Christian conversion and were protected by Khadif law against evangelization. It was in these historical contexts that two differing narratives of reform emerged to achieve what Laura Deeb calls, quote, a pious modernity, one that transposed and embedded spiritual progress with the universally assumed characteristics of technological advancement, consumerism, and the prioritization of individualized subjectivities. Other narratives looked to scientific studies to authenticate and resurrect an indigeneity that sought to reclaim and construct an imagined ancient past through communal reform. Both discourses, however, assumed Western history, representation, and notions of modernity as central cultural determinants for the rest of the world and a basis to, quote, stage their own modernity. And this is anthropologist Timothy Mitchell's terms. By imitating a Western-inspired notion of modernity, Mitchell argues that local articulations produce a simulacrum of an assumed universal narrative of progress. But, as he writes, quote, every performance of the modern is the production of this difference, and each difference represents the possibility of some shift, displacement, and contamination. In other words, in their attempt to mimic a Western modernity, here in the legibility and the scientific study of music, a Coptic pious modernity mirrored an Orientalist and disciplined impression of their community, and one with an inherent bias against the illegibility of their own and similarly colonized Muslim compatriots. I begin with Muftah's greatest rival, an Egyptian lieutenant by the name of Camille Ibrahim Ghobriel, who espoused this first interpretation of a pious and specifically modern. In 1916, Ghobriel published a small music booklet and called it, I'm translating here, The Musical Notation of the Response of the Church of St. Mark. It was part of his reformist efforts to combat what he described as a Coptic moral decay and a loss of a religious self in the face of cultural imports, such as pianos in upper and middle class homes. He also hoped to counter the seducing influences of American Presbyterians who made up a formidable presence in Egypt at the end of the 19th century. By combining religious traditions with modern tastes, Ghobriel proposed to restore such a spiritual loss by replacing the growth of popular love songs in Egypt, regarded as inappropriate tunes, with the transcriptions of Orthodox hymns that Copts could perform on piano in their homes and at communal events such as weddings and funerals. Modeling his work after missionary education, Ghobriel proposed modernizing Coptic music and liturgical services by adding an organ to all of the churches in Cairo, mixing and matching traditional hymns with, quote, modern tastes. He even proposed to personally finance such an endeavor himself, a suggestion that was met with outright fury, including the figure of Ramzy. So to give you an idea of just what the very same hymn that we heard of at the beginning sounds like in his transcription, we'll listen to it. And since there's no piano here, I'll do this. So it sounds a little bit different, yeah? Despite Ghubrial's work a decade earlier, it is Raghm Muftah that scholars and cantors favorably remember for taking a much more indigenizing perspective of a pious modernity. Rather, he's really written out of the history. Nobody knows that he even exists. Rather, Ghubrial is all but forgotten, and Muftah praised as the first indigenous scholar for his scientific study to save Coptic music from outside influence. Long before Muftah's materials were presented at the Library of Congress, the late Coptic patriarch, Pope Shenouda, pictured up there, even publicly praised his transcription efforts as almost divine. In his efforts to emulate European scholarship and to mirror the scientific ordering of sound, Muftah worked for over 75 years to transcribe, publish, and standardize the entire Orthodox liturgical hymnody, ironing out the debris of regional improvisation characterized by illiterate cantors and priests who orally disseminated the genre from cantor to cantor. As Muftah couldn't transcribe the Alhan himself, he commissioned between 1927 and 1936 English violinist and composer Ernest Newland Smith to produce 16 volumes of Coptic music transcriptions, notating the singing of one of the greatest singers and teachers in Coptic history, Al-Muallim, meaning teacher, Mikhail Girgis al-Batanoni. But it was in these volumes that Muftah and Newland Smith clearly struggled. Unsure what to do with Alhan's uneasy fit with the Western diatonic music scale and the florid melismas inherent in the genre, Newland Smith provided simple, prescriptive descriptions of the genre in an easy but stratified duple meter. Scribbled draft after draft in the Muftah collection also reveals Newland Smith's Orientalist preoccupation to unearth a true ancient Egyptian sound under, quote, this appalling debris of Arabic ornamentation. Convinced that Alhan held the key to the roots of Western classical music, Newland Smith toured Europe presenting his findings in provocative lectures. In one Oxford lecture, he plainly declared, quote, after careful study of these simple themes, we cannot but feel that much of the Western civilization must have its source in the Orient. But what he did produce didn't sound like anything like what Batanoni's students later sang and continue to sing today. So I'll give you a sound clip of Al-Muallim Batanoni singing the Alhan, and then I'll actually play what the transcription sounds like as well. So it's also the Trisagian hymn once again. To repeat, so we'll pause it here for 1 second. And then here's what Newland Smith's transcription sounded like, thanks to a very nice colleague at work who helped to play it for me. Despite Newland Smith's simple notations and Muftah's recordings of a strident but plain singing of Batanoni, all of Batanoni's students and contemporary singers today have emerged to sing Alhan with ornaments and melismas that are not in any of the recordings in the Muftah collection. As I continued my field research among various cantors and choirs, a question frequently haunted me. Is it possible that Newland Smith and Muftah asked Batanoni not to sing in a highly melismatic style that resembled this assumed backwardness of Arab debris and was fairly hard to transcribe? I don't know. Nothing in their writings indicate this, but the following generations of singers continue to speak rather than sing for themselves. And so here again is, I just want to replay the same recording that I played at the beginning, and this is the contemporary great teacher at the Coptic Patriarchate, and you'll notice just how much more, how different his recording sounds. Again, quite different, yeah? So back in Canada, Muftah's legendary work lives on. This past month, I began a preliminary project with the largest diaspora choir of Coptic hymns, the heritage of the Coptic Orthodox Church based in Mississauga, Ontario. Building from Muftah's archival collection, the choir has been publishing their own hymn books and recordings that have extended Muftah's efforts to record the things that he may have forgotten or the things that he may not have had the time to record. While the choir's director and quickly rising satellite star cannot read Western music transcriptions, he still references Newland Smith's transcriptions to approximate where melismas may or may not lie, and now their own recordings are much less melismatic than what's actually coming out of Egypt. In turn, he transposes his own notations, or hazet, to teach the next generation of both Egyptian and diaspora singers, both online and on satellite TV. When I asked him if a Coptic liturgical genre helped immigrant cantors to maintain their Egyptianness in any way, he replied, "I hope not. It's not meant to help their Egyptianness. It's meant to help them to keep their Coptic identity. We don't want Egyptian culture that's been adulterated by Arab things, Arabic culture, not the language or the other things from Islam, that has affected a lot of things. The purpose, again, is to build on Raghib Muftah and to be as much as possible a reference for the Coptic Church. By emphasizing difference, both in Egypt and now abroad, and by turning to Western music transcriptions to negotiate a separate Christian, modern citizenry untouched by Arab and Muslim inflection, Copts embody Mitchell's argument that every performance of the modern is the production of difference. By constructing themselves as exceptional, Copts push themselves further and further outside of Egypt's narratives of belonging. And as they increasingly immigrate outside of the country to places like the US, Australia, and Canada, it fuels all the more reason for Egyptian national narratives to further exclude them. Yet, as they continue to strive for a Western model modernity that looks to eradicate indigenous heterophony, improvisation, and the melismas of oral tradition, it gets harder and harder for Copts to negotiate other kinds of pluralities, of sounds, of religions, of a shared and echoing Egypt, and perhaps even of their new home in Canada as well. Thank you very much.